It began as a hushed exchange behind palace doors, one that aides tried to dismiss, yet could not contain. The moment Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepped out, pale and shaken, everything changed. Whatever Princess Charlotte had asked in that room wasn't ordinary. It was something the monarchy had long avoided confronting. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed was not a formal announcement, not a prepared statement, but a silence so deliberate it felt louder than any confession. Reports suggest the meeting inside Kensington Palace had been arranged quickly, almost urgently, bringing together Catherine, Prince William, and a small circle of senior advisors whose presence alone hinted at something far more serious than routine discussion. Insiders whisper that staff were instructed to keep their distance, conversations halted mid-sentence, and even long-standing aides were left outside. Closed doors, an unusual level of secrecy even for an institution built on discretion. Those familiar with palace rhythms began to notice the shift almost immediately. Catherine, known for her composure and measured presence, appeared unsettled in a way that could not be rehearsed away. It was in the subtle details of her steps, the way her expression lingered somewhere between concern and disbelief, that the gravity of the moment revealed itself. And at the center of it all was Charlotte, a young royal whose role has always been carefully defined, yet whose presence in such a serious conversation suggested something deeply personal had surfaced. This was not about ceremony, not about duty schedules or public engagements. This was about something far closer to the core of the family itself. Palace administrative streams, ranging from quiet staff observations to guarded media briefings, began to hint that tension had been building for weeks. Royal watchers noted small, but telling signs, moments during recent appearances where Catherine seemed momentarily distracted, William more protective than usual, and Charlotte herself unusually thoughtful for a child her age. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of royal commentary that what happened in that room did not come out of nowhere. Rather, it was the culmination of questions that had been quietly forming beneath the surface. Questions about identity, about place, about the invisible lines that define a royal life long before a child fully understands them. And yet the palace remained silent. No clarification, no denial, only a carefully maintained stillness that, to seasoned observers, spoke volumes. Because within the context of the monarchy, silence is rarely emptiness, it is strategy, containment, and sometimes quiet alarm. The idea that Charlotte's question could trigger such a reaction from Catherine suggests that it touched on something unresolved, something perhaps buried within the family's own history. Different interpretations of this moment describe it as a turning point, not because of what was said publicly, but because of what could no longer be avoided privately. What makes this moment so chilling is not just the secrecy, but the implication that a child's curiosity has intersected with a legacy too complex to be easily explained. Catherine, often seen as the steady bridge between tradition and modernity, suddenly found herself confronting a reality where shielding the next generation may no longer be enough, because when questions begin this early, and with this kind of weight, they rarely disappear, they evolve, deepen, and demand answers. And as those answers linger just beneath the surface, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. But what unsettled Catherine wasn't just the question, it was what that question revealed about the past. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But the single question from Princess Charlotte reportedly cut through years of royal silence, forcing Catherine, Princess of Wales, to confront something she had carefully shielded. Those closest to the inner workings of the palace suggest it was a question delivered with the kind of innocent curiosity only a child can carry, yet weighted with implications far beyond her years. It is now whispered that Charlotte, in her own quiet way, asked about her place, about what it truly means to belong to a family where roles are not just lived, but assigned. Not loudly, not defiantly, but clearly enough that it could not be misunderstood. And in that moment, the carefully maintained boundaries between truth and protection began to blur. Reports suggest the question touched on something the monarchy has long struggled to: define publicly the difference between those born to lead and those expected to support. The unspoken divide between heir and spare, a structure so deeply embedded within royal tradition that it often goes unquestioned until someone dares to ask why. For Catherine, who has spent years navigating that delicate balance with precision and grace. The moment was more than unexpected, it was deeply personal. Insiders claim her reaction was immediate, emotional, and impossible to mask, not because the question was inappropriate, but because it was inevitable. And inevitability, within the confines of royal life, can be far more unsettling than controversy. Those familiar with the family's recent history could not ignore the parallels. The echoes of Prince Harry's public struggles, his candid reflections on identity and hierarchy, seemed to resurface in a way no one had anticipated. Different interpretations of Charlotte's question describe it as a quiet mirror, held up to the institution itself, reflecting tensions that have never been fully resolved. For years, the narrative surrounding Harry has lingered at the edges of royal discourse, acknowledged but rarely addressed in depth. But now, insiders suggest, that narrative has found its way back into the heart of the family through a new generation, asking questions that are far harder to deflect. What makes this moment particularly significant is the growing awareness among younger royals. Unlike previous generations, they are not insulated from the world's conversations. They see, they hear, they begin to understand. And with that understanding comes curiosity, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes inconvenient, but always powerful. Palace insiders hint that Charlotte's question did more than surprise Catherine. It reopened conversations that had been quietly set aside, tensions that had been managed rather than resolved. Conversations about fairness, about expectation, about the cost of duty when it is defined before choice is even possible. And within that realization lies the deeper unease. Because once such questions are asked, they do not simply fade away. They linger, they evolve, they demand clarity in a system that has long relied on ambiguity. Catherine, who has worked tirelessly to present stability and continuity, now faces a reality where the next generation may not accept the same silent understandings. Where curiosity could lead to confrontation and innocence could unravel carefully constructed narratives. The palace, for all its history and tradition, finds itself navigating something far less predictable: the honesty of a child who is beginning to see the structure around her not just as a given, but as something to be understood. And as that understanding grows, so too does the pressure on those tasked with guiding it. Because this is no longer just about preserving an image or maintaining tradition, it is about answering questions that strike at the very core of what the monarchy represents. Questions that cannot be dismissed, cannot be redirected, and cannot be ignored without consequence. And suddenly, the issue wasn't just about Charlotte, it was about the future of the monarchy itself. For generations, the monarchy has operated on an unspoken rule: some are born to lead, others to support. But what happens when a child begins to question that divide? The answer is rarely simple, and within the walls of royal tradition, it is almost never comfortable. Because this divide, quietly understood, rarely explained, has shaped not just the institution, but the lives within it. The concept of heir and spare is not written in bold declarations, yet it exists in every title, every expectation, every carefully planned future. It is a system designed for stability, but one that often carries an emotional cost hidden beneath ceremony and duty. And now, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, faces the weight of her daughter's curiosity, that cost feels closer than ever. History offers its own warnings. The tension between King Charles III and Prince Harry did not emerge overnight. It was the result of years spent navigating that same divide. Reports suggest that the struggle to define identity within a rigid hierarchy left marks that could not be easily erased. Harry's story, widely discussed and often debated, became a modern reflection of an ancient structure, one where proximity to the crown can feel both like privilege and limitation. And while the palace has worked to move forward, to shift focus, to present unity, the echoes of that chapter have never fully disappeared. They linger, quietly shaping how the next generation is raised, guided, and, perhaps most importantly, protected. For Catherine, this is where the challenge deepens. She is not just a royal figure navigating protocol, she is a mother trying to balance truth with reassurance. Her role in modernizing the monarchy has often been praised, bringing warmth, relatability, and a sense of grounded normalcy to an institution steeped in tradition. Yet modernization does not erase structure. It softens it, adapts it, but the foundation remains. And now, As Charlotte grows up in an era where information is immediate and awareness comes early, the old approach of silence becomes harder to maintain. Children today do not simply accept, they ask, they observe. They connect the dots in ways previous generations never could. That awareness changes everything. Charlotte is not growing up in isolation from public discourse, she exists within it. Conversations about fairness, about roles, about identity are no longer confined to private corridors, they are part of the wider world she is beginning to understand. And with that understanding comes pressure, not just on her, but on those guiding her. Because preparing a child for a role they did not choose requires more than tradition, it requires explanation, reassurance, and sometimes difficult honesty. Catherine finds herself standing at that crossroads, where protecting innocence means deciding how much truth to reveal and when. This is the quiet conflict unfolding beneath the surface. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a public dispute, but something far more complex, a mother weighing the need to preserve stability against the need to answer a question that refuses to fade. Because once that divide is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once it is questioned, it demands acknowledgement. Catherine's struggle is not just about maintaining appearances, it is about shaping understanding in a way that does not repeat the fractures of the past. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so significant. It is not just about one question or one conversation, it is about the realization that the next generation may not accept the same unspoken rules without clarity. The system that has endured for centuries is now being examined through a different lens, one that values openness as much as tradition. And as that lens sharpens, the parallels to past struggles become harder to ignore, drawing an unmistakable line between what was and what could be. What made the moment even more unsettling was how closely it echoed a story the palace had hoped was over. The parallels were impossible to ignore. A young royal asking difficult questions and a system struggling to answer them without breaking. What had unfolded in that quiet moment between Princess Charlotte and Catherine? Princess of Wales was not isolated. Not SLU cha, ikratkoyen, yera, ikratkoye, and certainly not without precedent. It echoed something deeper, something the monarchy had already lived through, and in many ways was still trying to move beyond. Because long before Charlotte's question unsettled the present, there had been another voice older, louder, and far more public that had forced the institution to confront its own structure. The story of Prince Heir was never just about one individual, it was about what happens when the system's expectations collide with personal identity. And now, those echoes were returning, quieter this time, but no less powerful. Media narratives, once thought to have reached their peak, began to stir again. Conversations about hierarchy, about the invisible lines that separate roles within the royal family, resurfaced with renewed intensity. Reports suggest that commentators and insiders alike began drawing subtle but unmistakable comparisons, not because the situations were identical, but because the underlying questions were strikingly similar. What does it mean to grow up within a structure that defines your path before you fully understand it? And how does that understanding shape the choices that follow? These are not questions easily answered, and for Catherine, they carry a weight that extends far beyond public perception. Because unlike distant observers, she has witnessed the consequences firsthand. She has seen how those dynamics affected Heir, how the tension between expectation and individuality can evolve into something far more complex. Insiders whisper that this awareness has long influenced how she and Prince William approach their roles as parents. There has always been an effort, quiet but deliberate, to create an environment that feels more balanced, grounded, less defined by rigid hierarchy. But even the most thoughtful approach cannot fully erase the structure itself. And now, with Charlotte beginning to question it, the limits of that balance are becoming clear. Within palace circles, there is a growing sense of unease, not panic, but recognition. Recognition that the conditions which once led to internal fracture could, if left unaddressed, emerge again in a different form. The fear is not of rebellion, but of repetition. Because history within the monarchy does not repeat in identical patterns, it evolves, adapting to new voices, new perspectives, new generations. And Charlotte represents exactly that, a generation less willing to accept without understanding, less inclined to follow without questioning. That shift, subtle as it may seem, carries profound implications. It is also reflected in the smallest of changes. Those close to the family note subtle shifts in how William and Catherine navigate their parenting conversations that are perhaps more open explanations that go a little deeper, an effort to anticipate questions before they arise, not because they are reacting to crisis, but because they are trying to prevent one. Yet prevention, within a system built on tradition, is never straightforward. The monarchy's strength has always been its consistency, its ability to endure through adherence to established roles. But endurance alone is no longer enough if those roles themselves are being questioned from within. And this is where the challenge sharpens. The monarchy stands at a delicate intersection between preserving what has defined it for centuries and adapting to a reality where silence is no longer sustainable. To evolve is to risk change, to resist is to risk fracture. There is no easy path, no clear resolution. Only a growing awareness that the next steps will shape more than just public perception, they will shape the internal stability of the institution itself. And as those steps begin to take form, one truth becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. But this wasn't just history repeating, it was history demanding a different ending. For Catherine, the moment wasn't political, it was deeply personal. And those who saw her that day say she wasn't just shaken, she was changed. The weight of Princess Charlotte's question did not linger as a passing concern, it settled, quietly but firmly, into something far more profound. Because beneath the titles, beneath the expectations, Catherine is first a mother, and in that role, instinct takes over where protocol often hesitates. Reports suggest that in the hours following that private exchange, her focus shifted entirely, not toward strategy or public response, but toward understanding what her daughter truly meant, and more importantly, what she needed. It is in these moments that the carefully constructed balance between royal duty and personal responsibility begins to strain, revealing just how fragile that equilibrium can be. Insiders whisper that Catherine took a step back soon after, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough for those within the palace to notice. Engagements were quietly adjusted, appearances reconsidered, and the rhythm of her public role momentarily softened. To outside observers, it may have seemed routine, even expected. But within the context of what had just unfolded, it carried a different meaning. It was not withdrawal, it was recalibration. A moment to process, to reflect, to decide how to move forward in a situation where the answers were far from clear. Because the challenge she faced was not simply about responding to a question, it was about deciding how much of the truth to reveal, and when. The emotional toll of that decision cannot be understated. Catherine has long been seen as a stabilizing force within the monarchy, someone who navigates its complexities with quiet strength. But strength does not eliminate conflict, it often conceals it. And, now that conflict is internal. How do you prepare a child for a role they did not choose without burdening them with the weight of it too soon? How do you explain a system built on hierarchy in a way that feels fair, that feels just, that feels human? These are not questions with easy answers, and yet they demand to be addressed. In this moment, Prince William emerges not as a distant figure of duty, but as a partner navigating the same uncertainty. Reports suggest he stepped in quietly, offering support not just to Charlotte, but to Catherine as well. Because he, perhaps more than anyone, understands the complexity of what is unfolding. He has lived within that structure his entire life, felt its expectations, and witnessed its consequences. Together, they are now faced with a shared responsibility to guide their daughter through a reality that is both extraordinary and, at times, deeply complicated. Behind closed doors, conversations are said to have shifted, no longer centered solely on tradition or protocol, but on approach, on tone, on the future. How do they address questions that challenge the very framework they are part of? How do they ensure that curiosity does not turn into confusion, or worse, disillusionment? Palace insiders hint that these discussions are ongoing, evolving, shaped by the realization that the old methods, silence, deflection, careful avoidance, may no longer be enough. Because Charlotte's question has already changed something. It has opened a door that cannot simply be closed again. And within that realization lies a quiet but undeniable turning point. Catherine, once able to shield her children from the more complex aspects of royal life, now faces the truth that such protection has limits. The world they are growing into is different, more transparent, more questioning. And as that world intersects with the traditions of the monarchy, the need for honesty becomes harder to ignore. Not complete exposure, not overwhelming detail, but something closer to clarity, something that acknowledges reality without diminishing stability. Because once a question like that is asked, it cannot simply be ignored. What began as a private moment soon rippled outward, reaching aides, insiders, and eventually the public eye. The silence that once protected the inner workings of the palace began to fracture, not with a dramatic announcement, but through quiet leaks and whispered accounts that refused to stay contained. Reports suggest that details of the emotional exchange involving Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Princess Charlotte began circulating within internal circles, first staff members speaking in hushed tones, fragments of conversations slipping into places they were never meant to reach. It wasn't intentional exposure, it was something more subtle, more inevitable. Because moments charged with emotion rarely remain hidden for long, especially within an institution where every shift, every pause, is quietly observed. Palace aides, long trained in the art of discretion, moved quickly to contain the narrative. Insiders whisper that conversations were redirected, briefings carefully adjusted, and any suggestion of internal tension was softened before it could take shape publicly. Yet containment, in this case, proved far more difficult than expected. Because what had happened was not procedural, it was personal. And personal moments carry a different kind of weight, one that cannot always be managed through strategy alone. The more the palace attempted to maintain its composed exterior, the more attention the situation seemed to attract. Subtle changes in tone, in scheduling, in demeanor, each one became a point of speculation for those watching closely. And they were watching. Media narratives, already sensitive to any sign of internal strain, began to intensify. Observers noted Catherine's recent appearances with renewed scrutiny, searching for meaning in every word, every gesture, every moment of hesitation. Reports suggest that what might once have passed unnoticed was now being interpreted through a different lens, one shaped by the knowledge that something significant had occurred behind closed doors. The question was no longer whether there had been a moment of tension, but what that tension revealed about the future of the family itself. Public curiosity followed quickly. The idea that Charlotte, still so young, could be at the center of such a pivotal conversation sparked widespread interest. Not because of any controversy, but because of what it represented, a glimpse into how the next generation is beginning to engage with the realities of royal life. People began to ask their own questions. What does Charlotte understand about her role? How is she being prepared for it? And perhaps most importantly, how will that preparation differ from what came before? These questions, once confined to speculation, now carried a sense of urgency. Within the palace, the pressure began to build. The traditional approach, maintaining silence, allowing stories to fade on their own, was being tested in a way it had not been before. Because this was not a fleeting headline or a passing rumor, it was part of a larger narrative that continues to evolve. Insiders hint that there is a growing awareness among senior figures that the old methods of managing perception may no longer be sufficient. The world has changed, and with it, the expectations placed upon the monarchy. Transparency, once considered a risk, is now increasingly seen as a necessity. And yet, adapting to that reality is far from simple. The institution is built on continuity, on the careful preservation of tradition, and any shift, no matter how small, carries consequences. The challenge lies in finding a balance between openness and stability, between acknowledging change and maintaining the structure that defines the monarchy itself. It is a delicate, often uneasy process, one that unfolds slowly but with undeniable impact. As the story continued to spread, moving from quiet whispers to broader discussion, one thing became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just an internal moment, no longer confined to private reflection or controlled conversation. It had become part of a wider dialogue, one that questions not just individual roles, but the system as a whole. And as that dialogue grows louder, the pressure to respond grows with it, pushing the palace toward decisions it may have once avoided. And as the story spread, one thing became clear: the monarchy could no longer rely on old strategies. This wasn't just a family moment, it was a glimpse into the monarchy's future, unfolding in real time. What began with a single question from Princess Charlotte has now expanded into something far more significant. something that reaches beyond personal reflection and into the very structure of the institution itself. Because moments like these do not exist in isolation, they signal shifts, subtle at first, but powerful enough to reshape long-standing traditions. Reports suggest that within the inner circles of the palace, there is a growing recognition that the monarchy is entering a new phase, one defined not just by continuity, but by adaptation. And at the center of that shift stands Catherine, Princess of Wales, navigating a path that blends tradition with a more emotionally aware approach to royal life. For years, the monarchy has relied on a certain distance, an unspoken boundary between personal emotion and public duty. But that boundary is now being reconsidered. Insiders whisper that there is a quiet but deliberate movement toward a more open, more humanized way of engaging with both family and public expectations. Not a complete transformation, but a recalibration. Because the reality is becoming increasingly clear, the next generation will not respond to silence in the same way as those before them. They require understanding, context, and, perhaps most importantly, honesty. And that realization is beginning to influence how Prince William and Catherine approach their roles, not just as future leaders, but as parents shaping the mindset of a generation that will inherit a very different world. Charlotte, in many ways, represents that change. She is growing up in an era where information is immediate, where questions are encouraged, and where identity is something to be explored rather than assigned without explanation. This shift carries both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, it allows for a more grounded, more relatable connection between the monarchy and the public. On the other, it introduces complexities that the institution has not traditionally had to confront so directly. Because addressing questions about role and identity early requires a level of openness that can feel at odds with the monarchy's long-standing preference for discretion. Public response to this evolving dynamic has been notably supportive. There is a growing appreciation for a monarchy that feels more accessible, more human, more reflective of the world it represents. People are no longer just observing, they are engaging, forming opinions, and, in many cases, advocating for a more transparent approach. This shift in perception adds another layer of pressure, reinforcing the idea that adaptation is not just an internal necessity, but an external expectation as well. The monarchy, once able to shape its narrative with minimal input from the outside world, became increasingly isolated from the outside world. Now finds itself part of a broader conversation it cannot fully control. Within the palace, discussions are said to be ongoing, focused not just on immediate responses, but on long-term structural considerations. How can the institution evolve without compromising its core identity? How can it remain relevant while preserving the traditions that define it? These are not questions with quick answers, and the process of addressing them is likely to be gradual, measured, and at times, uncertain. But what is clear is that the conversation has begun, and once begun, it cannot simply be set aside. Because this moment, quiet as it may have seemed at first, has already set something in motion. It has highlighted the need for clarity where there was once silence, for dialogue where there was once assumption. And as that momentum continues to build, the monarchy finds itself standing at a crossroads, facing a future that demands both reflection and change. But even as change loomed, one question remained: how much could the institution truly adapt? In the end, it wasn't the palace, the press, or tradition that forced this reckoning. It was a child asking a simple, honest question. That truth lingers, quiet but unshakable, at the heart of everything that has unfolded. Because for Catherine, Princess of Wales, this was never just about protocol or perception, it was about the moment when motherhood and monarchy collided in a way that could not be carefully managed, diplomatically deferred. The emotional weight of Princess Charlotte's question did not fade with time, it deepened, settling into something that continues to shape every decision, every conversation, every step forward. Reports suggest that Catherine has carried that moment with her not as a burden, but as a turning point. Because once faced with such clarity, there is no returning to the comfort of unspoken assumptions. Charlotte's question, simple in its form yet profound in its impact, has become more than a fleeting moment, it has become a signal. A signal that the next generation is not only observing the structure around they, but beginning to understand it, to question it, and perhaps even to reshape it. This is where the significance lies. not in disruption, not in rebellion, but in awareness. And awareness, within an institution built on continuity, introduces a quiet but undeniable shift. The monarchy now stands at a crossroads, caught between preserving the traditions that have defined it for centuries and embracing a more open, more responsive approach to the realities of modern life. Within that crossroads, Catherine emerges in a role that is both familiar and entirely new. She remains the steady figure the public recognizes, the embodiment of grace under pressure, but beneath that exterior, there is evolution. She is no longer just navigating the expectations placed upon her, she is actively redefining how those expectations are understood by those who will inherit them. Protector and reformer, balancing the need to shield with the need to prepare, she carries the responsibility of ensuring that the past does not dictate the future without question. And that balance is not easily maintained. It demands strength, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Because the tension between duty and individuality has not disappeared, it has simply changed form. It exists now in quieter spaces, in conversations behind closed doors, in decisions that may never be publicly acknowledged but carry lasting impact nonetheless. The challenge is no longer just about maintaining unity, it is about ensuring that unity does not come at the cost of understanding. And that is where the true test lies. Not in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the subtle, ongoing effort to align tradition with a world that no longer accepts silence as an answer. What is unfolding is not a dramatic transformation, but something far more complex, a gradual, deliberate shift that may only be fully understood in hindsight. Yet even now, its presence can be felt. In the way questions are approached, in the way answers are considered, in the recognition that the next generation will define the monarchy not just by what they inherit, but by how they choose to carry it forward. And as that realization settles in, it becomes clear that this moment, this single question, has already left its mark. Because sometimes, the most powerful challenges too. Centuries-old institutions don't come from rebellion, but from a single question no one was prepared to answer. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.